Have you ever had one of those moments where you wish you could turn back time and undo a single decision that changed absolutely everything? I'm talking about the kind of moment that replays in your mind over and over again, each time making you cringe harder than the last, making your stomach turn with regret so deep it physically hurts. Well, let me tell you about the day I became that person, the manager everyone warns you about, the cautionary tale that gets whispered in break rooms and shared in online forums. My name is Marcus, and I was 28 years old when I committed career suicide in the most spectacularly humiliating way possible. I had everything going for me. Absolutely everything. I was the youngest branch manager in the history of Prestige Financial Group, a position that usually went to people with at least 15 years of experience. But there I was, sitting in that corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the downtown skyline, feeling like I owned the world. My suits were tailored, my watch was expensive, my car was imported, and my ego was astronomical. I genuinely believed I had figured out the secret formula to success, and I wore my arrogance like a badge of honor, completely oblivious to the fact that I was building my empire on a foundation of sand that was about to crumble beneath my feet. The thing about success when it comes too early is that you start to believe your own hype. You start to think that you're special, that the rules don't apply to you, that your instincts are always right, and your judgments are infallible. I would walk through that bank every morning like I was walking a red carpet, nodding at employees who scrambled to greet me, making snap decisions about people based on nothing more than their appearance, their clothes, the car they drove, the watch they wore. I had this twisted belief system that I could tell everything about a person's financial status just by looking at them, and I prided myself on this supposed skill, this ability to read people in seconds. My colleagues called me the closer because I had this reputation for landing the biggest accounts, the wealthiest clients, the deals that made headlines in our quarterly reports. But here's what nobody knew. Here's the dirty little secret that I kept hidden beneath all that polish and shine. I wasn't actually that good at my job. I was just really good at profiling people, at cherry-picking the clients who already looked successful and ignoring everyone else. I would literally judge a book by its cover, every single time, and somehow, miraculously, I had gotten away with it for 3 whole years. 3 years of getting promoted, praised, and put on a pedestal for what was essentially discrimination dressed up as business acumen. I remember the exact date like it's burned into my brain with a hot iron. October 17th, a Tuesday that started like any other Tuesday but ended with my entire world imploding. The morning had been routine, almost boring actually. I had my usual overpriced coffee from the artisan cafe across the street, the one where they knew my order by heart, because God forbid I drink regular coffee like normal people. I reviewed some portfolios, approved a few loans, rejected even more based on criteria that had more to do with my gut feelings than actual financial analysis. Around 2 in the afternoon, I was standing near the teller stations chatting with Jennifer, one of our senior tellers, when I noticed him walk in through the main entrance. The way he looked, I'll never forget it, and I wish I could because the memory fills me with such profound shame that sometimes I can barely breathe when I think about it. He was wearing clothes that had definitely seen better days, a faded jacket that looked like it came from a thrift store, jeans that were worn at the knees, shoes that were scuffed and old, and he carried himself with this quiet, almost apologetic demeanor, like he wasn't sure he belonged there. His hair needed a cut. His hands looked weathered and rough, the hands of someone who worked with them every single day, and there was this humility about him that I completely misread as weakness. I felt Jennifer tense up beside me, and I could see the other tellers exchanging glances, that look that said they were preparing themselves for a difficult customer, maybe someone who was going to argue about overdraft fees or complain about policies. And me and my infinite stupidity and unchecked arrogance, I made a decision right then and there that this person wasn't worth my time, that he was probably going to be some low-balance customer with problems I didn't want to deal with, someone who would take up valuable time I could spend courting actually important clients. So I did something that still makes me sick to my stomach when I replay it in my mind. I turned to Jennifer and whispered, just loud enough that a couple of other employees could hear, "Looks like we've got a real high roller here." And then I actually laughed, this condescending, cruel little laugh that conveyed everything about my character in that single sound. Jennifer's face flushed red with embarrassment, not for herself but for me, and she quickly looked away, pretending to be busy with paperwork. I should have recognized that reaction as a warning sign. Should have understood that she was trying to distance herself from what I had just done, but I was too wrapped up in my own sense of superiority to notice. The man approached the counter, and I watched from my position about 10 feet away, still wearing that smug expression, still thinking I was so clever, so perceptive, so much better than this person who had just walked into my bank. He spoke quietly to one of our junior tellers, Marcus Jr. we called him, though his real name was Trevor, and I saw Trevor's eyes widen slightly as he looked at his computer screen, his fingers freezing on the keyboard for just a moment before he composed himself professionally. That should have been my second warning sign, but I was blind, completely and utterly blind to what was about to unfold. I actually started to turn away, planning to head back to my office where I had a conference call scheduled with some potential investors, when I heard Trevor say in a slightly elevated voice, clearly meant to get someone's attention, "Sir, for a transaction of this size, I'm going to need to get our branch manager to approve it and assist you personally." The words hit me like ice water, and I felt this weird flutter in my chest, this first tiny whisper of doubt. But even then, even with that direct signal that something was different about this customer, my arrogance wouldn't let me believe I had been wrong. I thought maybe he was trying to withdraw a few $1,000s. Maybe he had a small business account. Nothing that would actually challenge my assessment of him. Nothing that would prove my snap judgment had been completely, horrifically incorrect. I walked over with what I'm sure was still an air of condescension, my professional smile plastered on my face, that fake warmth that I had perfected over years of customer service training. "Is there something I can help you with?" I asked, my tone polite on the surface but underneath carrying just the slightest edge of impatience, like I was doing him a favor by even acknowledging his presence. The man looked at me with these kind, tired eyes that had seen so much more of life than my privileged, sheltered existence could even begin to comprehend, and he said simply, "I need to transfer some funds and discuss some investment opportunities." The way he said it was so understated, so humble, without any of the bravado or self-importance that I associated with wealthy clients, and that threw me off even more. In my warped worldview, rich people announced their wealth. They demanded attention. They wore their success like armor. So this quiet, unassuming approach didn't compute with what I thought I knew about money and power. I gestured toward my office, still not fully grasping the magnitude of my mistake, still thinking this was going to be some modest transaction that I would handle quickly before getting back to my actually important work. We walked across the marble floor of the bank, my expensive shoes clicking confidently while his worn sneakers made barely any sound, and I held the door open for him with this performative courtesy that was really just another expression of my superiority complex. Once inside, I sat down behind my impressive mahogany desk, another symbol of my success that I had specifically chosen because it made me feel powerful, and I pulled up his account on my computer, expecting to see exactly what I had assumed, a basic checking account with maybe a few $1,000s, possibly a small savings account, nothing that would require my expertise or attention. But the moment those numbers loaded on my screen, I felt my entire body go completely rigid, every muscle locking up like I had been hit with a bolt of electricity, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that my vision actually blurred for a second because my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. The account balance read $47,683,412.67, and below that were investment portfolios, stock holdings, real estate assets, and business accounts that brought his total net worth with our institution to somewhere in the realm of $78 million. $78 million. I was staring at one of the wealthiest clients our bank had ever had, possibly the wealthiest client currently banking with our branch, and I had just mocked him, laughed at him, judged him based solely on his appearance, treated him like he was beneath my notice, all while he sat there with more money than I would make in 50 lifetimes. The room started to spin, and I felt this wave of nausea roll through me so intensely that I had to grip the edge of my desk to steady myself, my knuckles turning white from the pressure, my palms instantly slick with cold sweat that made my expensive Mont Blanc pen slip from my fingers and clatter onto the desk with a sound that seemed deafening in the sudden silence. I looked up from the screen to meet his eyes, and in that moment, I saw that he absolutely knew what I had done, what I had said, how I had judged him, and there was this flash of something in his expression. Not anger exactly, but disappointment. Sadness maybe, like he had seen this behavior before, like this wasn't the first time someone had underestimated him based on appearances. and that somehow made it so much worse. My mouth opened, but no words came out. My vocal cords paralyzed by the sheer horror of my situation, my mind racing through every possible way to recover from this catastrophic error in judgment, but coming up empty because there was no recovery, no smooth talk, no charm that could erase what I had done, what multiple employees had witnessed me do. The man whose name I now saw on the screen was Robert Chen, a name I vaguely recognized from some financial journal I had skimmed months ago, sat there calmly, his weathered hands folded in his lap, waiting for me to speak, giving me the opportunity to either dig myself deeper or attempt some kind of damage control, though we both knew the damage was already done, already catastrophic, already irreversible. Mr. Chen, I finally managed to croak out, my voice sounding strangled and desperate even to my own ears. I apologize for the wait. Let me pull up your complete portfolio and we can discuss your investment needs. I was trying so hard to sound professional, to pretend that the last 5 minutes hadn't happened, to reset the interaction and start over, but it was like trying to unring a bell, impossible and foolish and painfully obvious in its futility. He looked at me for a long moment and I could see him making a decision, weighing whether to call me out directly on my behavior, or to let it slide, to give me an undeserved pass that my actions absolutely did not warrant, and I found myself hoping, praying, desperately pleading in my mind for mercy I had no right to expect. "Young man," he said finally, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that made my expensive office suddenly feel very small. "I've been banking with Prestige Financial for 12 years, long before you worked here, and in all that time I've never experienced what I just experienced walking into this branch today." The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy, and I felt my carefully constructed image of myself as a successful, competent professional crumbling like a sandcastle hit by a wave, revealing the ugly truth underneath, the prejudiced, superficial, arrogant person I had become without even realizing it. My career, my reputation, my future, everything I had worked for and built and prided myself on, all of it was flashing before my eyes in that moment, and I absolutely knew with crushing certainty that nothing would ever be the same again, that this moment would define me, haunt me, follow me for the rest of my professional life and beyond. Have you ever made a judgment about someone that turned out to be completely wrong? Have you ever let your assumptions about people based on how they look cloud your ability to see who they really are? Because I'm about to tell you exactly how that kind of thinking destroyed everything I had, and maybe, just maybe, my story will save you from making the same catastrophic mistake I made. Let me take you back to the beginning, to understand how I became the person capable of such breathtaking arrogance and stupidity. Because nobody starts out this way. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to become the villain in their own story. It happens gradually through a series of small choices and compromises and justifications that eventually transform you into someone you wouldn't have recognized just a few years earlier. I grew up in a comfortable middle-class family in the suburbs. Nothing spectacular, nothing terrible, just ordinary in every way, with parents who worked hard and expected me to do the same, who valued education and ambition, and making something of yourself in the world. I was always good with numbers, always had this natural affinity for mathematics and logic, and I excelled in school without having to try too hard, which I now realize was actually a disadvantage because it taught me that success should come easily, that I didn't need to struggle or question myself or develop humility through failure. I graduated near the top of my class, got accepted to a decent business school, and landed an internship at Prestige Financial during my junior year, an internship that turned into a full-time position after graduation, and from there, my rise was meteoric, almost suspiciously fast in retrospect. Within 6 months, I was promoted from junior associate to senior associate, beating out people who had been with the company for years, and I attributed this to my superior skills and intelligence rather than recognizing it for what it probably was, a combination of luck, timing, and maybe some favoritism from executives who saw potential in me, or liked my style, or wanted someone young and hungry, who would do whatever it took to close deals. My first year as senior associate, I brought in 3 major accounts, clients with significant portfolios who I had courted aggressively, and my commission from those accounts alone was more than my father made in an entire year as a high school math teacher, a fact that I shamefully mentioned to him during a family dinner, watching his face fall with disappointment that I was too self-absorbed to properly interpret at the time. The praise kept coming, the promotions kept happening, and somewhere in that whirlwind of success I stopped being Marcus Rodriguez, the kid from the suburbs who was grateful for opportunities, and became Marcus Rodriguez, the banking prodigy who deserved everything he achieved and more, so much more, because clearly I was special. Clearly I had figured out something that other people hadn't. Clearly I was just better at this than everyone else. By the time I turned 26, I was assistant branch manager, and the branch manager at the time, a woman named Patricia Sanderson who had 30 years of experience and had seen everything in the banking industry, tried to mentor me, tried to teach me about the importance of treating every customer with respect regardless of their account balance, about building relationships rather than just chasing numbers, about integrity and ethics and all these concepts that I nodded along to while internally dismissing as outdated thinking from someone who didn't understand modern banking. Patricia would tell me stories about customers who came in looking like they had nothing but turned out to be incredibly wealthy, or customers who looked wealthy but were drowning in debt, and she would emphasize over and over that you simply could not judge a person's financial situation by their appearance, but I smiled and agreed, and then went right back to doing exactly what she was warning me against, because my way was working, my numbers were phenomenal, so clearly she was wrong and I was right. When Patricia retired, there was a selection process for the new branch manager position, and I was convinced it would go to Gerald Matthews, a 15-year veteran who knew every aspect of the business inside and out, who had built relationships with clients that spanned decades, who actually cared about people rather than just seeing them as numbers on a spreadsheet. But the corporate office, in their infinite wisdom or maybe their infinite foolishness, decided that what the branch needed was young energy, fresh perspective, aggressive growth strategies, all the buzzwords that essentially meant they wanted someone who would prioritize profits over people, and that someone was me. The day they announced my promotion, I remember walking into that office, my office now, and feeling like I had won the lottery, like I had beaten the system, like I was invincible, and nothing could touch me or bring me down from this incredible high. Gerald congratulated me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and I was too intoxicated by my own success to notice the concern in his expression, too blind to see that he was worried about what my leadership would mean for the branch culture, for the employees, for the clients who had trusted this institution for years. I started making changes immediately, implementing new policies that prioritized high-net-worth individuals, creating a tiered service system that essentially meant if you didn't have a certain amount of money in your accounts, you weren't worth our time or attention. You got shuffled to junior staff while I personally handled the important clients. I would literally scan the waiting area when I walked through, picking out people who looked wealthy based on their clothes, their accessories, their demeanor, and I would approach them personally, introducing myself as the branch manager, offering them priority service, making them feel special while completely ignoring everyone else who didn't meet my arbitrary visual criteria for wealth. My staff hated this, absolutely hated it, and I could see the resentment building in their eyes during meetings when I would push these policies, when I would emphasize the importance of focusing on high-value clients, when I would basically tell them that some customers mattered more than others, but they couldn't say anything because I was their boss. I had the authority. I had the backing of corporate who loved my numbers and didn't care about my methods. Jennifer, the senior teller who would later witness my downfall, actually tried to talk to me about it once, pulled me aside after a staff meeting and said very carefully, very diplomatically, that she felt we were alienating long-time customers who might not look wealthy, but who had been loyal to the bank for decades, and I brushed her off with some corporate nonsense about market segmentation and strategic resource allocation, fancy words that meant absolutely nothing except that I didn't want to hear what she was saying because it contradicted the narrative I had built about myself and my success. The truth that I couldn't admit, not to myself and certainly not to anyone else, was that I was terrified of actual hard work, terrified of having to build relationships slowly and carefully, terrified of the patience and genuine human connection that real banking required, so I took shortcuts. I relied on superficial judgments. I convinced myself that I had this special ability to read people, when really I was just perpetuating stereotypes and prejudices that made my job easier, but made me a worse person and a worse banker. There were warning signs everywhere if I had been willing to see them. Clients who quietly closed their accounts and moved to other institutions, employees who requested transfers to other branches, online reviews that mentioned feeling unwelcome or judged, but I explained all of it away, told myself those were just people who didn't appreciate excellence, who couldn't handle high standards, who were probably not the kind of clients we wanted anyway, and this self-delusion, this willful blindness, allowed me to continue down a path that was always going to end in disaster. It was just a matter of when and how spectacular the crash would be. My personal life suffered too, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Relationships ended because I was so consumed with work and status and maintaining my image. Friendships faded because I only wanted to associate with people who I felt enhanced my social standing. Family gatherings became uncomfortable because my parents and siblings could see what I was becoming, and they didn't like it. They didn't like me anymore. And instead of that being a wake-up call, I just spent less time with them. Surrounded myself with colleagues and acquaintances who reflected back the image I wanted to see. Successful, important, superior. I started spending money recklessly, buying things I didn't need to maintain an image of wealth that wasn't actually real, because while I made good money, I wasn't anywhere near as rich as I pretended to be. I was just good at looking the part. Designer suits that cost more than my rent, a luxury car that I could barely afford, a watch that I bought on credit and paid off in installments while telling everyone I paid cash for it. All of it performance, all of it hollow, all of it compensation. For the growing emptiness I felt inside but refused to acknowledge. Do you know what it's like to wake up every morning and have to put on a mask? To have to be someone you're not? To maintain this exhausting performance of superiority and confidence when deep down you're scared and insecure and increasingly aware that you're not actually as good as everyone thinks you are? That was my life for 3 years. 3 years of pretending. 3 years of building higher and higher on a foundation of lies and arrogance and prejudice. 3 years of moments like the one with Robert Chen that I either didn't notice or explained away. And it all came crashing down on that Tuesday in October, when I finally encountered a situation that I couldn't talk my way out of or ignore or rationalize away. Sitting there in my office with Robert Chen, watching him process my behavior, feeling the weight of my mistakes settling onto my shoulders like concrete, I experienced for the first time in years a moment of absolute clarity, a stripping away of all my defenses and delusions where I saw myself exactly as I was, and it was horrifying, truly, deeply horrifying in a way that made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. Mr. Chen, I started again, my voice shaking now, all pretense of professional composure completely abandoned. I owe you an apology. What I said, how I treated you when you came in, it was inexcusable, completely inexcusable, and I have no defense for it except my own ignorance and prejudice. The words felt like they were being ripped from somewhere deep inside me, admissions I had never made to anyone including myself, and saying them out loud made them real in a way that was almost unbearable. But I forced myself to continue because I owed him at least that much honesty. I made assumptions about you based on your appearance, and those assumptions were not only wrong but offensive and discriminatory. And I understand if you want to close your accounts and take your business elsewhere because, frankly, I would do the same thing in your position. Robert Chen sat there listening, his expression unreadable, his weathered hands still folded calmly in his lap, and I found myself thinking about those hands, about what they represented, about the work and sacrifice and journey that had brought him to this point in his life where he had $78 million, but still wore old clothes and drove a modest car and carried himself with humility that I, with my comparatively tiny achievements, had never managed to develop. May I ask you something? He said finally, his voice still quiet but somehow filling the entire office, and I nodded, terrified of what he was going to say but knowing I deserved whatever was coming. Do you treat all your customers this way? Making judgments before you even speak to them, or was it just me? The question cut right to the heart of it, exposing not just this one incident, but the entire system I had built, the entire philosophy I had operated under. And I knew that my answer to this question would determine not just what happened with this client, but what kind of person I was going to be going forward. I could lie. I could tell him it was an aberration, a one-time mistake. I could try to minimize and deflect and protect myself, or I could tell the truth and face the full consequences of my actions. And in that moment, sitting there with my career hanging by a thread, I chose truth. Maybe for the first time in years. Before. No, sir, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't just you. I had a system, where I would assess customers based on appearance and treat them differently based on that assessment. I prioritized people who looked wealthy and dismissed people who didn't. And I trained my staff to do the same, and I'm realizing now, sitting here, that I have probably hurt and offended and lost countless customers because of this approach. And I have no excuse for it except that I thought I was good at my job when really I was just good at being prejudiced. The confession hung in the air between us, and I saw something shift in Robert Chen's expression. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps a recognition that I was at least being honest, at least acknowledging the full extent of my failure rather than trying to minimize it. I built my wealth over 40 years, he said, his words measured and deliberate, starting with nothing, absolutely nothing, working in a factory, in construction, in any job I could find, saving every penny, investing carefully, taking calculated risks, and yes, eventually becoming very successful. But I never forgot where I came from. I never forgot what it feels like to be judged, to be dismissed, to be treated as less than human because you don't look the part. His eyes held mine, and I couldn't look away even though every instinct was screaming at me to escape this conversation, to run from this moment of accountability. The clothes I'm wearing today, these are the clothes I wore when I was struggling. When I had nothing, I keep them and wear them sometimes to remind myself of that journey, to stay humble, to remember that wealth is not a measure of worth, and also, if I'm being honest, to test places like this to see how people treat someone who doesn't look like their idea of success. The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut, the understanding that this had been a test, one that I had failed so spectacularly, so completely, that there was no recovering from it, and part of me felt angry, defensive, wanting to argue that it wasn't fair to set people up like that, but the larger, more honest part of me knew that it was absolutely fair, that if I treated people differently based on appearance, then I deserved to be called out on it, deserved to face the consequences. I've been considering moving my accounts to another institution, Robert Chen continued, and I felt my heart literally stop in my chest, felt the blood drain from my face as I calculated what losing a $78 million client would mean for my branch, for my performance metrics, for my career. And it was catastrophic, absolutely catastrophic, the kind of loss that would trigger investigations and reviews and questions from corporate that I would have no good answers for. But before I make that decision, I want to know what you're going to do about this, not just with me, but with your entire approach to banking, because this isn't just about one rude comment. This is about a culture you've created here, a culture that I suspect affects not just clients, but your employees as well. He was right. Absolutely right. And I knew it. Could feel the truth of his words resonating through every fiber of my being. And I realized that this moment was either the end of my career or the beginning of something entirely different. A fork in the road where I had to choose between defending my old self and my old ways, or completely tearing down everything I had built and starting over from scratch. Mr. Chen, I said, and I could hear the desperation in my voice, but also something else. Something that might have been the first seeds of genuine humility. I don't know if I can fix this. I don't know if you can trust me, or if my staff can trust me, or if I can even trust myself after what I've done. But I want to try. I want to completely overhaul how this branch operates, how I operate. And I know that's not enough. I know words mean nothing without actions. But I'm asking you, begging you, really, to give me a chance to prove that I can be better, that this bank can be better. I could see him weighing my words, assessing my sincerity, and I held my breath, waiting for his verdict, knowing that whatever he decided would echo through the rest of my life. I'll tell you what, he said finally. I'm not going to close my accounts today, but I am going to watch very carefully how things change here. And if I don't see real, meaningful change, not just surface-level policy adjustments, but actual cultural transformation, then I will move my business elsewhere. And I will make sure people know why. Do we understand each other? I nodded frantically, relief flooding through me even though I knew this was just a temporary reprieve, not a pardon, just a chance to prove myself, a chance I absolutely did not deserve but was grateful for nonetheless. Thank you, I managed to say, my voice thick with emotion that I was no longer trying to hide. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I won't waste it, I promise. Robert Chen stood up to leave, and I scrambled to my feet as well, nearly knocking over my chair in my haste. And as he reached the door, he turned back and said something that would stay with me forever. Words that would become my guiding principle in the years to come. Remember, young man, wealth isn't worn on the outside. Character is, and right now, your character needs work. Then he was gone, walking back through the branch in his thrift store jacket and worn jeans. And I stood there in my office, expensive suit and all, feeling smaller and more ashamed than I had ever felt in my entire life, knowing that everyone in the branch had seen what happened, knowing that the story would spread, knowing that my reputation was in tatters and my career was hanging by a thread, but also knowing somehow that this was the best thing that could have happened to me. The wake-up call I desperately needed, even though it came in the most painful way possible. Have you ever had someone hold up a mirror to your worst qualities and forced you to really look at yourself? It's devastating. But sometimes devastation is the only thing that can break through years of self-delusion and arrogance. The immediate aftermath of that meeting was unlike anything I had experienced in my professional life. A cascade of consequences and realizations that came at me so fast I could barely process them, each one hitting harder than the last, stripping away another layer of the protective delusion I had built around myself. I stood there in my office for what must have been 20 minutes after Robert Chen left, just standing there staring at nothing, my mind racing but also somehow completely blank, like I was experiencing shock, like my brain couldn't quite accept what had just happened and what it meant for my future. Through the glass walls of my office, I could see my employees whispering to each other, casting glances in my direction, and I knew they were talking about what they had witnessed, about my behavior when Robert Chen first arrived, about whatever they had observed during our meeting, and I felt this crushing weight of shame that was almost physical in its intensity, making it hard to breathe, hard to stand upright. Jennifer caught my eye from across the branch floor, and the look on her face was something between pity and disappointment, and that somehow hurt more than anger would have, because anger I could have dismissed or defended against, but disappointment, genuine disappointment from someone who had tried to warn me, who had tried to guide me toward better behavior, that cut straight through all my defenses. I sat back down at my desk and pulled up Robert Chen's full file, really looking at it for the first time, seeing not just the impressive numbers but the history behind them. 12 years of consistent deposits, careful investments, modest withdrawals, a pattern that spoke of discipline and long-term thinking. And I saw notes from previous interactions with other bank employees, notes that described him as kind, patient, understanding, always polite, never demanding, the kind of client that any institution should be grateful to have. And I had treated him like garbage based on nothing more than my prejudiced assumptions about what wealthy people should look like. I started thinking about how many other customers I had mistreated over the years, how many people had walked into this branch hoping for professional service and had instead encountered my judgment and dismissiveness, how many accounts we had lost because of my behavior, how many potential clients had never returned after their first visit, and the scope of the damage I had done, not just to my career, but to this institution and to individual people who deserved better, was staggering, overwhelming, almost incomprehensible in its magnitude. My hands were shaking as I picked up my phone to call my regional manager, David Thornton, knowing that I had to report this incident before Robert Chen did, knowing that getting ahead of the story was my only chance of maintaining any credibility, but dreading the conversation, dreading the disappointment and anger I would hear in David's voice. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up, his voice cheerful and unsuspecting. "Marcus, good to hear from you. How are things at the branch?" And I felt my throat tighten, because I was about to destroy that cheerful tone, about to deliver news that would change how he saw me, how everyone at corporate saw me. "David," I said, my voice sounding strange and hollow, "I need to report a serious incident that occurred today, an incident involving my behavior toward a high-net-worth client, behavior that was inappropriate and discriminatory and has put the branch at risk of losing a $78 million account." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, a silence that seemed to stretch on forever, and I could almost hear David's mental gears turning as he processed what I had just said, as he calculated the implications, as he shifted from seeing me as his star branch manager to seeing me as a liability and a problem. "Walk me through exactly what happened," he said finally, his voice now completely devoid of warmth, professional and clipped, the tone you use when you're already preparing for damage control. And I did. I told him everything. Every detail of my behavior, every word I had said, every assumption I had made, holding nothing back because I knew that sanitizing the story would only make things worse when the full truth inevitably came out. By the time I finished, I could hear David typing on his keyboard, probably already drafting emails to his superiors, already setting in motion whatever protocols existed for this kind of situation, already calculating how to minimize the damage to the bank's reputation, and I realized with cold clarity that protecting me was not his priority. Protecting the institution was, as it should be. "I'm going to need you to document all of this in writing and send it to me within the hour," David said, his voice tight. "And I'm going to have to escalate this to corporate compliance and our executive team. This is exactly the kind of behavior that we have explicit policies against, and the fact that it came from a branch manager makes it even more serious." I felt my stomach drop even further, which I hadn't thought was possible as the full reality of my situation became clear. This wasn't just going to be a reprimand or a warning. This was going to be a formal investigation, possibly disciplinary action, possibly termination. And even if I somehow kept my job, my reputation was destroyed. My chances of advancement were gone. Everything I had worked for was crumbling. "I understand," I said quietly. "And David, I know this doesn't change anything, but I want you to know that I am completely aware of how wrong I was, how serious this is, and I'm committed to doing whatever it takes to make this right, to change how I've been operating, to be better." I could hear the skepticism in his silence, the unspoken question of whether this was genuine remorse or just self-preservation. And honestly, I wasn't entirely sure myself in that moment. It was probably both, tangled up together in a mess of emotions and realizations that I was still trying to process. "We'll discuss your commitment to change after the investigation," David said. "Right now, I need you to focus on documentation and making sure that Mr. Chen feels heard and valued. The last thing we need is for him to go public with this or to move his substantial assets to a competitor. Do you understand?" I confirmed that I did, and we ended the call, and I sat there staring at my computer screen, at the blank document where I was supposed to pour out my confession, my professional suicide note, essentially, and I felt this weird mixture of fear and relief. Fear of the consequences, but relief that I didn't have to pretend anymore. Didn't have to maintain the facade of perfection, could finally be honest about my failures even if that honesty destroyed me. I spent the next hour writing the most difficult document of my professional life, detailing not just the incident with Robert Chen, but the entire culture I had created at the branch, the policies I had implemented that prioritized appearance over substance, the training I had given my staff that essentially taught them to discriminate, all of it, every ugly detail, because I realized that if I was going to face consequences, I might as well face them for the full scope of what I had done, rather than just this one incident. When I hit send on that email, I felt this strange sense of relief mixed with terror, like I had just jumped off a cliff and was in that moment of freefall before impact, knowing the crash was coming but not yet feeling it. I looked at the clock and realized it was almost 5, almost time for the branch to close, and I knew I needed to address my staff, needed to tell them what had happened before they heard it from someone else or read it in some corporate communication, needed to own my mistakes in front of the people who had witnessed them and suffered under my leadership. I walked out of my office and asked everyone to gather for a brief meeting before we closed, and I could see the apprehension on their faces, the curiosity, the wariness, because impromptu meetings from management are never good news, and I'm sure they were wondering if there were going to be layoffs or restructuring or some other corporate disaster. We gathered in the small conference room, all 12 members of my staff squeezing in around the table, and I stood at the head of the table, looking at their faces, these people who I had worked with for years but never really seen as individuals, never really valued the way I should have. "I need to tell you about something that happened today," I began, my voice shaking slightly. "Something that I'm ashamed of and that you all deserve to know about because it affects how this branch operates and how I have been leading you." I saw them exchange glances, confused, uncertain, and I pressed on, telling them about my interaction with Robert Chen, about my discriminatory comment, about the confrontation in my office, about the conversation with David and the investigation that was now underway. The room was absolutely silent as I spoke, and I could see shock registering on some faces, recognition on others who had probably suspected my behavior was problematic, but had never felt empowered to call me out on it, and validation on the faces of those like Jennifer, who had tried to warn me and been dismissed. I owe all of you an apology, I continued, because I have created a culture here that prioritizes the wrong things, that treats customers differently based on superficial characteristics, and I have put pressure on you to adopt these same prejudices. And that is not acceptable. It's not ethical, and it's not the kind of banking we should be doing. Jennifer spoke up, her voice calm but firm. Some of us tried to tell you this, Marcus. We tried to say that your approach was wrong, that it was hurting people and hurting the bank, but you wouldn't listen. Her words weren't accusatory, just factual, but they stung because they were absolutely true. I had been warned. I had been given opportunities to change course, and I had ignored them all because I thought I knew better. You're right, I acknowledged. You did try to tell me, and I didn't listen. And that failure to listen, that arrogance, has led us to this point. And I don't know what's going to happen to me. I don't know if I'll still be your manager next week or next month, but regardless of what happens, I want you to know that I am committed to changing, to learning from this, and to making sure that if I do remain in this position, we create a completely different culture here, one that treats every customer with dignity and respect regardless of what they look like or how much money they have. I could see some skepticism in their eyes, which was fair. Words were cheap and I had a lot to prove, but I also saw some hope, some possibility that maybe this disaster could lead to something better, could be the catalyst for real change. We talked for another 30 minutes with staff members sharing their own experiences of feeling pressured to judge customers, of turning away people who might have been good clients, of feeling uncomfortable with the policies I had implemented, and hearing it all laid out like that, hearing the full impact of my leadership from the people who had experienced it daily, was devastating but also necessary, a reckoning that I absolutely needed to face. By the time we finished and everyone went home, I felt emotionally exhausted but also strangely lighter. Like confession, even painful confession, had released some of the pressure that had been building inside me for years. I was the last one to leave the branch that night, walking through the empty building, turning off lights, setting the alarm, doing these mundane tasks while my mind spun with questions about what came next, what the investigation would uncover, what consequences I would face, what my future looked like if I even had a future in banking. I sat in my expensive car in the empty parking lot, and for the first time in years I cried, really cried. Not polite tears, but ugly, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep inside. Grief for the person I had become, shame for the hurt I had caused, fear for what I was facing, but also maybe, just maybe, the beginning of relief that I didn't have to be that person anymore, that I could choose to be different, to be better, even if it cost me everything. When I finally drove home that night, I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized myself, not because I looked different physically, but because I was seeing myself clearly for the first time in years, seeing past the expensive suit and the confident exterior to the broken, arrogant, prejudiced person underneath, and it was horrifying. But also, somehow, the first step toward actually becoming someone worth being. Do you ever wonder how the people around you really see you? What they really think about your behavior when you're not looking? That night, I learned the answer, and it was far worse than I could have imagined. The next few weeks were, without exaggeration, the most difficult period of my entire life. A gauntlet of investigations, interviews, reviews, and confrontations that stripped away every last shred of my professional dignity and forced me to examine aspects of my character that I had spent years avoiding. The corporate investigation began the very next day, with a team of 3 people from the compliance department descending on the branch like auditors, requesting files, interviewing staff, reviewing security footage, building a comprehensive case that documented not just the incident with Robert Chen, but the entire pattern of behavior that had led to it. I had to sit through multiple interviews where I was questioned in detail about my policies, my training methods, my interactions with customers, and every answer I gave seemed to dig the hole deeper, to reveal another layer of problematic behavior that I hadn't even recognized as problematic until it was being dissected by professional investigators. They pulled customer satisfaction surveys, and I watched in horror as they read through comment after comment from people who had felt judged, dismissed, or discriminated against at our branch, comments that I had seen before but had always explained away as coming from difficult customers or people who didn't understand our business model. But hearing them read aloud in that conference room, hearing the pain and frustration in those written words, made it impossible to maintain those comfortable delusions anymore. The investigators interviewed my staff one by one, in private sessions where employees were encouraged to be completely honest without fear of retaliation. And while I never got to hear exactly what was said in those interviews, I could see the relief on people's faces when they came out, the relief of finally being able to speak truth without consequences, and I knew that what they were sharing was probably damning, probably painted a picture of my leadership that was even worse than I had admitted to myself. I had to turn over emails and memos that documented my instructions to staff about prioritizing certain customers, and seeing those communications compiled and analyzed, seeing the pattern that emerged of systematic discrimination dressed up in corporate language about resource allocation and strategic focus, was devastating, because it eliminated any possibility of claiming this was just one mistake, just one bad day. This was clearly intentional, clearly a philosophy I had developed and implemented deliberately over years. During this time, I also had to continue managing the branch, though my authority was severely undermined by everyone knowing I was under investigation, by the visible presence of corporate investigators, by the uncertainty about my future, and I quickly discovered that leading without respect is nearly impossible. People followed my directions because they had to, not because they wanted to, and the difference was stark and painful. Robert Chen came back to the branch twice during those weeks, and each time I saw him walk in, my stomach would clench with anxiety and shame. But he was gracious, almost kind, asking about the changes I was implementing, offering suggestions from his perspective as a longtime customer, and I realized that he was genuinely interested in seeing improvement, that his threat to leave wasn't just about punishing me, but about creating actual positive change. I started implementing new policies immediately, even before the investigation concluded, because I figured if I was going to go down, I might as well go down trying to fix what I had broken. I eliminated the tiered service system, instituted mandatory training on unconscious bias for all staff including myself, created a customer feedback system that actually got reviewed and acted upon, and personally reached out to apologize to several customers who had filed complaints in the past, conversations that were humiliating and difficult, but also necessary, and, in some cases, surprisingly, healing. One woman, Mrs. Patterson, who I had basically ignored during her visits because she came in wearing house dresses and orthopedic shoes, broke down crying when I called to apologize, and she told me that she had been a customer of the bank for 45 years, since she was a young bride, and that the way she had been treated in recent years had made her feel invisible and worthless. And hearing that, knowing that my behavior had caused that pain to someone who had been loyal to this institution for longer than I had been alive, crushed me in a way that no corporate punishment could. The investigation concluded after 3 weeks with a report that was scathing in its assessment of my leadership and recommended serious disciplinary action, including the possibility of termination, and I was called to a meeting with David Thornton and 2 executives from the corporate office to discuss their findings and determine my fate. I walked into that meeting expecting to be fired, had actually prepared myself for it, had started looking at job postings and updating my resume and mentally preparing for the humiliation of having to explain why I left my position as branch manager. But what happened was somehow both better and worse than termination. They offered me a choice: I could resign and receive a severance package and a neutral reference that wouldn't detail the reasons for my departure, essentially allowing me to save face and move on to another position somewhere else. Or I could accept a demotion, go back to being a senior associate, work under new management, and prove through my actions over time that I had genuinely changed and learned from this experience. The first option was easier, cleaner. Let me escape the daily reminder of my failures and start over somewhere else where nobody knew my story. But something in me, maybe the first genuine growth I had experienced in years, made me choose the second option, made me choose to stay and face the consequences and do the hard work of rebuilding my reputation from the ground up. "I'll take the demotion," I said, and I saw surprise flash across their faces because clearly they had expected me to take the easy way out. "I want to stay and prove that I can be better, that I can be the kind of banker that customers and colleagues deserve. And I understand that's going to take time, and I understand that I'm starting from zero in terms of trust, but I'm willing to do that work." David Thornton looked at me for a long moment, and I couldn't quite read his expression, but finally he nodded and said, "All right, Marcus, we'll give you that chance, but understand that you'll be on probation for a year, you'll be closely monitored, And if there's any indication that you're falling back into old patterns, you're done. No second chances, no appeals. Done. Are we clear? I nodded, feeling relief and trepidation in equal measure. Relief that I still had a job and a chance to make things right. Trepidation about what it was going to be like to go from being the boss to being subordinate to someone else, to have my every action scrutinized, to have to rebuild from scratch. The day they announced my demotion to the staff was excruciating. Standing there while the new branch manager, a woman named Sharon Torres who had 20 years of experience and a reputation for ethical leadership, was introduced, watching my former employees react with relief and hope, knowing that they were happy to see me demoted, and having to accept that their happiness at my failure was justified and deserved. Sharon pulled me aside after the announcement and said something that I will never forget. I've read the full report on what happened here, and I want you to know that I don't believe in defining people by their worst moments. I believe people can change if they genuinely want to. So I'm going to give you a fair chance to prove yourself, but I'm also going to hold you accountable, and if you can't handle that, you should leave now. I told her I could handle it, that I wanted to handle it, that I was grateful for the opportunity, and I meant it, even though I knew the road ahead was going to be brutal. The first few months working under Sharon were an education in humility and actual professional competence, watching her interact with every customer the same way, regardless of their appearance, seeing her build genuine relationships based on trust and service rather than transactions and numbers, learning that real success in banking isn't about closing the biggest deals but about creating value for people and helping them achieve their financial goals, whatever those might be. She would observe my customer interactions and give me feedback, pointing out moments when my old habits would surface, times when I would unconsciously judge or prioritize based on appearance, and having those blind spots exposed over and over again was uncomfortable but necessary, like physical therapy that hurts but heals. I started seeing customers as individuals with their own stories and struggles and dreams, rather than as numbers on a balance sheet, started asking questions and actually listening to the answers, started building relationships that were based on genuine connection rather than transactional value, and it was slower, harder work than what I had done before, but it was also more satisfying in a way that surprised me. There was a moment, about 6 months into my demotion, when an elderly man came into the branch wearing clothes that were clean, but clearly old and inexpensive, and my first instinct, my trained response from years of prejudice, was to dismiss him as unimportant. But I caught myself, recognized that pattern, and instead I approached him with genuine openness and asked how I could help. He needed assistance setting up a trust fund for his grandchildren, and as we talked, I learned that he was a retired veteran who had saved carefully his entire life and had a modest but respectable portfolio that he wanted to ensure would benefit his family after he was gone. And helping him with that, seeing the gratitude in his eyes, feeling like I had actually served someone rather than just processed a transaction, gave me more satisfaction than any of the major deals I had closed during my time as branch manager. Robert Chen became something of a mentor to me during this period, which was grace that I absolutely did not deserve but that he offered anyway, meeting with me occasionally for coffee and sharing insights from his own journey, talking about the importance of character over appearance, of long-term thinking over short-term gains, of humility and service and integrity, all the values that I had dismissed as old-fashioned or irrelevant, but that I was slowly, painfully learning were actually the foundation of genuine success. He told me once that he had considered leaving the bank after our initial encounter, but had decided to stay specifically to see if real change would happen, to see if his confrontation would lead to transformation or just to superficial adjustments. And knowing that he was watching, that he cared enough to invest in my growth even after how I had treated him, motivated me in ways that corporate threats never could. My personal life started to change too as I changed. Relationships that had fallen apart because of my arrogance slowly began to heal. My parents noticed the difference in how I talked and carried myself and engaged with the world. My sister told me that she had missed me, the real me, and was glad to have me back, and I started to understand how much my professional problems had been symptoms of deeper character issues that infected every area of my life. I started therapy, something I would have considered weak or unnecessary in my old life, and began unpacking the insecurity and need for validation that had driven my obsession with status and appearance, began understanding that my discrimination against others had been rooted in my own fear of not being good enough, my own desperate need to feel superior as compensation for feeling inadequate. It was hard work, painful work, facing aspects of myself that I had hidden for years, but it was also liberating, like cleaning out an infected wound. It hurt, but it was necessary for healing. By the time my probation period ended, I was a fundamentally different person than I had been when this journey started. Different in ways that went far beyond just my behavior at work. Different in my understanding of value and worth and success and what actually matters in life. Sharon called me into her office on the last day of my probation, and I sat there nervously, still not entirely sure whether I had done enough, whether I had proven myself, whether I would get to continue this journey, or whether I had fallen short. "Marcus," she said, looking at me with those sharp eyes that missed nothing, "I've been watching you very carefully for the past year, and I've seen real change, not just in your actions, but in your motivations, in who you are as a person, and I want you to know that I'm going to recommend that you come off probation and be considered for promotion, back to assistant branch manager, not because I think you've arrived, but because I think you're genuinely committed to the journey, and that's what matters." I felt tears spring to my eyes which would have embarrassed me a year ago, but which I now recognized as a healthy emotional response to grace and kindness, and I thanked her. Told her that I would never forget the chance she had given me, the patience she had shown, the leadership she had modeled. "Don't thank me yet," she said with a slight smile, "because if you do get promoted, you're going to be responsible for training our new hires, and I expect you to teach them everything you've learned, to make sure that the culture we've built here continues and grows. Can you do that?" I told her I could, that I would, that nothing would make me prouder than to help other people avoid the mistakes I had made, to pass on the lessons I had learned through such painful experience. The promotion came through 2 months later, and this time, instead of feeling superior or entitled, I felt humbled and grateful, aware that this was a responsibility and a trust that I needed to earn every single day, not something I was owed or deserved. I developed a training program for new employees that focused on unconscious bias, on seeing the individual rather than the stereotype, on building relationships rather than just processing transactions. And I would tell my story, the whole embarrassing, shameful story of my downfall and what I learned from it, using my failure as a teaching tool to help others avoid the same path. Robert Chen came to one of these training sessions at my invitation and shared his perspective as a customer who had been discriminated against, and the impact of hearing from him directly, of seeing his humanity and dignity and grace, was powerful for the new employees in a way that my lectures never could be. I reconnected with Jennifer and other staff members who had tried to warn me during my arrogant phase, apologized to them properly, thanked them for their patience and for not giving up on me even when I didn't deserve their faith. And I learned to surround myself with people who would challenge me and hold me accountable, rather than just people who would tell me what I wanted to hear. My metrics as assistant branch manager were different from what they had been before. I was no longer the person bringing in the biggest accounts or closing the flashiest deals, but I was the person with the highest customer satisfaction scores, the most positive reviews, the best employee retention. And I learned that those metrics, while less glamorous, were actually much more valuable indicators of real success and sustainable leadership. There were still hard days, still moments when I would catch myself falling into old patterns of judgment, still situations that triggered my insecurity and my need to prove myself. But now I had the tools and the awareness to recognize those moments and choose differently, to pause and reflect rather than react, to seek perspective rather than assume I was right. I learned to apologize quickly when I made mistakes, to admit when I didn't know something rather than pretending, to ask for help rather than trying to do everything myself. All the behaviors that I had once seen as weakness, but now understood as strength. My relationship with money changed too. I got rid of the expensive car and the designer suits, not because I couldn't afford them, but because I no longer needed them to feel valuable. I learned to live more modestly and actually save money rather than spending it all maintaining an image. And I discovered that financial security feels much better than financial performance. I started volunteering at a financial literacy program for low-income families, teaching people who had been dismissed and judged by institutions like banks how to manage their money and build wealth. And the irony of me, someone who had been so prejudiced against people without visible wealth, now serving that very community, was not lost on me, but it felt right, felt like a way to give back and to continue my own growth and learning. Looking back now, 5 years after that catastrophic Tuesday in October when Robert Chen walked into my branch and exposed everything that was wrong with me, I can see the entire journey with a clarity that would have been impossible in the moment. I can see how necessary that devastation was, how the destruction of my career and my ego created space for something better to grow, how sometimes mercy looks like consequences, and grace looks like accountability. I'm still in banking, still at Prestige Financial actually, but in a completely different role now. I'm the Regional Director of Customer Experience and Ethical Practices, a position that was created partly in response to the issues that my case exposed, and my job is to make sure that what happened with me doesn't happen anywhere else in our organization, to train managers and staff on inclusive practices, to investigate complaints of discrimination, to build systems that prioritize people over profits while still maintaining financial success. It's work that I love, work that feels meaningful in a way that my old job never did, even when I was succeeding by conventional metrics, because now I'm part of creating actual positive change rather than just enriching myself or the institution. I still see Robert Chen occasionally. We've become friends in a way that seems improbable given how we met, and he continues to share wisdom from his journey, to remind me of what matters, to hold me accountable with kindness. He told me recently that he had never intended to destroy my career that day, that he had been genuinely torn about whether to report what happened or give me a chance to change, and that seeing the transformation that came from that confrontation had renewed his faith in people's capacity for growth. "You know," he said during one of our coffee meetings, "I've had money for a long time now, and I've learned that wealth can reveal character, but it doesn't create it. The person you are when you have nothing is the same person you are when you have everything, just with different resources to express it, and the work you've done hasn't been about learning to treat rich people better. It's been about learning to see the humanity in everyone regardless of their circumstances. And that's character work, that's soul work, that's the kind of transformation that actually matters." His words reminded me of something my father had said when I finally told him the full story of what happened. After years of keeping it hidden because I was ashamed, my father, who I had condescended to about his teacher's salary, looked at me and said, "Son, I'm glad you learned this lesson now, while you're still young enough to do something with it. Some people go their whole lives never learning that wealth and worth are different things, never understanding that how you treat people, when you have power over them, is the real measure of your character." I think about all the people I hurt during my years of arrogance, all the customers who felt dismissed or devalued, all the employees who worked in a toxic culture I created, all the opportunities for genuine connection and service that I missed because I was too busy performing success to actually be successful. And while I can't undo that damage, I can learn from it. I can use it to fuel my commitment to doing better, to being better, to creating systems and cultures that prevent others from making the same mistakes. I think about who I might have become if Robert Chen hadn't walked into my branch that day, if he had gone to a different bank, or if I had somehow gotten away with my behavior one more time. And I realized that I would probably still be that person, still arrogant, still discriminatory, still empty inside despite all the external markers of success. And while the price of change was high, the cost of not changing would have been so much higher. This journey has taught me that redemption is possible, but it's not easy. It's not a single moment of decision, but 1,000 daily choices to be better, to resist old patterns, to choose humility over pride, service over status, character over appearance, and some days I make those choices well and some days I struggle. But the key is to keep choosing, keep trying, keep growing, even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when nobody's watching to applaud your effort. If you're reading this or listening to this story, and you recognize something of yourself in who I was, if you've been making snap judgments about people based on how they look, if you've been prioritizing image over substance, if you've been building your success on a foundation of prejudice and arrogance, I want you to know that you can change, you can choose differently. You don't have to wait for your own catastrophic moment of reckoning. You can start right now, today, with the very next person you encounter, to see them fully, to value them genuinely, to treat them with the dignity that every human being deserves, regardless of their appearance or their bank balance. And if you've been on the receiving end of this kind of discrimination, if you've been judged or dismissed or treated as less than because you didn't look the part or fit someone's narrow definition of worth, I want you to know that their judgment says everything about them and nothing about you, that your value is inherent and doesn't depend on anyone else's recognition, and that there are people and institutions out there who will see you and appreciate you and serve you with the respect you deserve. So here's what I want you to do, and this is my call to action, not just for engagement but for actual change in the world. I want you to think about the last time you made an assumption about someone based on their appearance. Think about how that assumption affected how you treated them, how you interacted with them, what opportunities you might have missed because of your prejudice, and I want you to commit right now to approaching the next week differently, to consciously choosing to see people as individuals rather than stereotypes, to treating everyone you encounter with genuine respect and curiosity, regardless of what they look like or what you assume about their circumstances. If this story touched you, if it made you think or feel or recognize something in yourself that needs attention, leave a comment below and tell me about it. Tell me about a time when you were wrong about someone, or a time when someone was wrong about you. Because sharing these stories creates community and accountability and reminds us that we're all works in progress. We're all capable of both terrible mistakes and beautiful growth. Hit that like button if you believe that people can change, that redemption is possible, that our worst moments don't have to define us if we're willing to do the hard work of transformation. Because every like is a vote for hope over cynicism, for growth over judgment, for the belief that we can all be better than we've been. Subscribe to Through My Eyes for more stories like this. Stories that don't just entertain but challenge and inspire and maybe, just maybe, change how you see the world and your place in it. Stories told from the perspective of people who've learned hard lessons and want to share them, so others can benefit from their mistakes without having to make those same mistakes themselves. And turn on that notification bell because these stories drop regularly, and you don't want to miss them. You don't want to miss the chance to be part of a community that believes in growth and change and second chances, a community that looks past surfaces to see substance, that values character over appearance, that understands that the most important work we do isn't building our careers or our bank accounts, but building our character and our capacity to see and serve and value the humanity in everyone we meet. Remember, the next person you encounter might be your Robert Chen, the person who looks like nothing but is actually everything, the person who could teach you the most important lesson of your life if you're humble enough to learn it, the person who could change your trajectory if you're brave enough to let them. So approach every interaction with openness and respect and genuine curiosity, because you never know who you're really talking to. You never know what someone's story is. You never know how your treatment of them might affect their day or their self-worth or their faith in humanity. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for being willing to look at uncomfortable truths about prejudice and arrogance and the ways we all fall short of who we want to be. And thank you for believing, as I have learned to believe, that we can always choose to be better, starting right now, starting with the very next choice we make about how to see and treat the people around us.